March 1944, over Berlin. A B-17 Flying Fortress named All-American takes a direct flak hit to the fuselage. The explosion tears through the radio room, killing the radio operator instantly and blowing a hole 3 feet wide in the side of the aircraft. Shrapnel shreds hydraulic lines, oxygen systems, and electrical cables. The pilot feels the controls go mushy. The entire crew can feel the aircraft shuddering, barely holding together. They're still 300 miles from England with the North Sea to cross, and 6 crew members are still alive on a plane that by all engineering calculations should be falling out of the sky. But they made it home. Every single one of them walked away. How did American engineers design bombers that could absorb punishment that should have destroyed them? And how did crews survive hits that defied every probability? Let me explain what flak actually was, because understanding the threat explains why the engineering solutions were so critical. Flak comes from the German word Fliegerabwehrkanone, anti-aircraft cannon. German 88mm flak guns would fire shells that were fused to explode at specific altitudes. When these shells detonated near a bomber, they sent thousands of white-hot steel fragments in every direction at supersonic speeds. A single flak burst could shred everything within a 200-foot radius. And the Germans had thousands of these guns protecting every major target. The problem was physics. A B-17 at combat altitude was flying at maybe 180 miles per hour. Flak shrapnel was traveling at over 3,000 feet per second. The bomber couldn't dodge. The crew couldn't hide. They had to fly straight and level during the bomb run to give the bombardier time to aim. For those 5 to 10 minutes, they were essentially sitting targets in a sky filled with explosions. On a mission over a heavily defended target like Berlin or the Ploesti oil fields, a single bomber might encounter hundreds of flak bursts. The question wasn't if you'd get hit, it was whether you'd survive when you did. Boeing engineers working on the B-17 design knew this was coming. They couldn't make the bomber invulnerable, that would require so much armor the plane couldn't fly. Instead, they designed for survivability. The key insight was redundancy and compartmentalization. Critical systems had backups. The aircraft was divided into sections so damage to one area wouldn't necessarily doom the entire plane. And certain innovations made all the difference between a disabled aircraft and a catastrophic loss. The most important innovation was the self-sealing fuel tank. Before this, a single incendiary round or hot shrapnel hitting a fuel tank would ignite the fuel and the bomber would explode. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were lost this way in the early war. Engineers developed a multi-layer tank design with a layer of rubber compound between the inner and outer walls. When punctured, the rubber would swell from contact with fuel and seal the hole. Not perfectly, and not permanently, but enough to prevent catastrophic fuel loss and fire long enough to get home. This sounds simple now, but it saved thousands of lives. There are documented cases of B-17s returning to base with fuel tanks that had 50 or more holes in them, each one sealed by that rubber layer. The crew would be losing fuel, yes, and they might not make it all the way back to England, but they wouldn't explode in mid-air. They had a chance. That's what survival engineering is about, not preventing damage, but giving the crew a fighting chance after damage occurs. The second critical design was the control system redundancy. The B-17 had 2 sets of control cables running from the cockpit to the control surfaces, one on each side of the fuselage. If flak severed the cables on one side, the other side could still function. The pilots might have reduced control authority, but they could still fly the plane. Later models added even more redundancy with additional cable runs and reinforced attachment points, but here's where it gets really interesting. The engineers couldn't predict every possible damage scenario, so they designed the aircraft structure with what's called fail-safe design. The fuselage was built with multiple load-bearing frames and stringers. If one frame was destroyed by flak, the adjacent frames would carry the load. The wing spars were designed so that even if one spar was partially severed, the remaining structure could handle flight loads, at least temporarily. The entire aircraft was essentially a redundant network of structure where no single point of failure would cause immediate catastrophic loss. Real combat proved the design worked in ways even the engineers hadn't anticipated. There's a famous case of a B-17 called Old 666 that took over 400 hits from flak and fighter cannon fire during a single mission. The nose was shattered, the No. 3 engine was destroyed, the tail section was barely attached, and the fuselage had so many holes it looked like a colander. But the basic structure held together. The pilots maintained control. They made it back. Another B-17 collided with a German fighter mid-air. The fighter's wing sliced through the B-17's fuselage just behind the bomb bay, cutting more than halfway through the aircraft. The tail section was hanging on by a few structural members and some skin on the bottom of the fuselage. The pilots couldn't believe the plane was still responding to controls. They flew it over 200 miles back to base and landed it. When engineers examined the wreckage, they found that the few remaining stringers and the lower skin had been just strong enough to transfer control inputs from the elevators to the cockpit. The design margins had been perfectly calculated, but the aircraft engineering is only half the story. The crews themselves developed survival techniques based on understanding what the design could handle. Pilots learned to fly with asymmetric damage, one or two engines out, part of a wing blown off, tail surfaces partially destroyed. They learned which control inputs would work and which would overstress the damaged structure and tear the plane apart. This wasn't in any manual. This was learned through experience, through survival, through pilots making it home and telling others what worked. Bombardiers and navigators learned to prepare for flak hits. They'd remove anything loose that could become a projectile when shrapnel came through. They'd position themselves to avoid being directly in line with known vulnerable points. They understood that the aircraft's armor plate was positioned to protect against hits from certain directions, primarily from below and ahead where German fighters typically attacked, so they'd position themselves behind armor when possible during the flak heavy bomb run. The waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner had the most exposure. There was minimal armor in their positions because weight was critical and armor everywhere would make the plane too heavy to fight effectively. These men relied on luck and the compartmentalized design. If flak came through their section, the structure was designed to contain the damage to that area. Bulkheads would prevent shrapnel from continuing forward or aft into other crew positions. Not always. There are tragic cases where single flak bursts killed multiple crew members, but often enough to matter statistically. One of the most critical survival factors was damage assessment and decision-making. After a serious flak hit, the pilot had to make instant decisions. Can we stay in formation? Do we need to drop out? Can we make it to the target or should we abort? Do we have enough control authority to maneuver? The crews themselves developed survival techniques based on understanding what the design could handle. Pilots learned to fly with asymmetric damage, one or two engines out, part of a wing blown off, tail surfaces partially destroyed. They learned which control inputs would work and which would overstress the damaged structure and tear the plane apart. This wasn't in any manual. This was learned through experience, through survival, through pilots making it home and telling others what worked. Bombardiers and navigators learned to prepare for flak hits. They'd remove anything loose that could become a projectile when shrapnel came through. They'd position themselves to avoid being directly in line with known vulnerable points. They understood that the aircraft's armor plate was positioned to protect against hits from certain directions, primarily from below and ahead where German fighters typically attacked, so they'd position themselves behind armor when possible during the flak heavy bomb run. The waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner had the most exposure. There was minimal armor in their positions because weight was critical and armor everywhere would make the plane too heavy to fight effectively. These men relied on luck and the compartmentalized design. If flak came through their section, the structure was designed to contain the damage to that area. Bulkheads would prevent shrapnel from continuing forward or aft into other crew positions. Not always. There are tragic cases where single flak bursts killed multiple crew members, but often enough to matter statistically. One of the most critical survival factors was damage assessment and decision-making. After a serious flak hit, the pilot had to make instant decisions. Can we stay in formation? Do we need to drop out? Can we make it to the target or should we abort? Do we have enough control authority to maneuver? Is the structure going to hold together or should we bail out now while we're still over friendly or neutral territory? The aircraft gave them information. If the controls responded, even sluggishly, the cable systems were at least partially intact. If the engines were running and producing power, the fuel system and ignition systems were functioning. If they could maintain altitude and airspeed, the wings and basic airframe were structurally sound enough to fly. Pilots learned to read these signs instantly and make life-or-death decisions in seconds. There's a documented case where a B-17 took a direct flak hit that destroyed the number 2 engine and set it on fire. The pilot couldn't feather the propeller, the mechanism was damaged, so the prop was windmilling and creating massive drag. Fire was spreading along the wing. Standard procedure would be to bail out immediately. But this pilot assessed the situation and realized they were only 20 minutes from the English coast. He calculated that the wing structure would hold for 20 minutes, that the fire suppression bottles had slowed the fire enough to give them that window, and that the 3 remaining engines could maintain enough altitude to clear the coast. He was right. The crew stayed with the plane and made it to an emergency airfield in England. The survival rate statistics tell the story. Early in the war, before these engineering solutions were fully implemented, the loss rate on missions to heavily defended targets sometimes reached 10% or higher. That's unsustainable. As the improved B-17G models with all the accumulated design improvements entered service, and as crews learned the survival techniques, the loss rate to flak specifically decreased even as the Germans added more anti-aircraft guns. The aircraft and crews were getting tougher faster than the defenses were getting deadlier. By the end of the war, the B-17 had proven that smart engineering combined with crew training could create survival margins even in the most lethal environment ever created. The redundant systems, the self-sealing tanks, the fail-safe structure, the armor placement, the compartmentalization, all of these came together. Not every crew made it home. The losses were still terrible. But thousands of crews survived flak hits that would have destroyed aircraft design just a few years earlier. The legacy continues today. Modern aircraft design still uses these same principles: redundancy, compartmentalization, fail-safe structures, damage tolerance. Combat aircraft are designed assuming they will be hit and engineering around that reality. The B-17 crews flying through flak over Germany proved that with the right design and the right training, survival was possible even when the odds said you should be dead. That's not luck. That's engineering meeting courage and creating the margins that let people come home.